Okay, so we are today with Professor Bartolomé Yun-Casalilla, who currently is Professor of Early Modern History at the University Pablo de Olavide in Seville, and was for 10 years Professor at the UI, and has been our last Max Weber lecturer. And in this interview, Tommaso Stefini and I will try to ask him about his trajectory and his current work and future projects. Professor, thanks for being here. And my first question would be about your intellectual biography. We see maybe two main turning points in your career. The first would be when you turn or you changed your perspective from the Annal school to a more political and cultural perspective at the beginning of your career, more influenced by Anglo-Saxon authors. And the second one, I would say that was when you broaden your geographical scale and you pass from being a historian, of the Spanish monarchy in the Iberian Peninsula to a historian of the Iberian worlds. So what do you think about it, and what can you tell us about these two moments in your trajectory? Professor, we cannot hear you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you for this interview, Andrés and Tommaso, and for, of course, to the EY and to the Max Weber program for its kind invitation to give a talk here the other day. You are asking about intellectual trajectories. First, I must say that like many other historians of my own generation in Spain, I was very much influenced by the French school, and particularly the Annal school. And as a matter of fact, I started my thesis with that idea in my mind. It was a regional study on a particular region in the north of in the Duero Valley, in the north of the Duero Valley in Spain. But at this point, when I was writing the thesis, I came across the Brenner debate, and that was very important for me because I could see that some of the questions I could use to interrogate my material were not so much embedded in the tradition of the Annal school, but rather in the tradition of the Brenner debate and the transition to capitalism. I was very much also interested in the way political factor and forces influences economic development. I used to say that I wanted to do a sort of social history of the economy, and particularly I was also very much impressed by Lawrence Stone's works on the aristocracy. That was a region in which the aristocracy presence was very, very, very strong, and that was in part of the turning point. But then, of course, I get also in contact with the work by John Eliot and also by some of his students, Tony Thompson, for example, Jago, Geoffrey Parker, Richard Kagan, etc. And I thought that it would be a good idea to try to look at this particular region with a wider perspective, in which I would try to situate that research in a more in a wider scale, which is the construction of the state and the social events, by making also introducing some contingencies in the way I was looking at my sources. So at the end, this was very far away from what the analyst school of that epoch, because we can speak about different types of analyst school, were telling us. And then, of course, after finishing my thesis, I traveled to the institute in Princeton, and of course there I was also very much in contact with the Anglophone historiography. And then, of course, here in the UI, where I came in 2003, I also had that experience. Of course, this was also parallel to a change in the scope of my research. I in fact started with a study on Cordoba. It was a local study where I tried to understand some more general phenomenon. But then I went to this regional study, something which was crucial in my intellectual life after writing a book on the history of the Spanish monarchy in the Iberian Peninsula, Marte contra Minerva. Something which was crucial was precisely the comments that some friends make of that book, telling me that one of the problems of the book was that the presence of both Portugal and America was completely ignored. And then I went to Seville as a professor at the beginning of the 21st century. And then I met there students who were working on Latin America. And I was the advisor, and I have been the advisor of several students, Latin American students, of which I'm really very proud of, because I learned very much. And I learned how other historiographies were dealing with problems that looked at from the Iberian Peninsula were very very difficult. So the outcome of all this is a widening of the geographical spectrum, of the geographical landscape, but also a sort of change in the type of questions that I was asking myself. Here in the Institute, since 2003, we were very much in contact with transnational history, comparative history, and then global history. We worked quite a lot on the problem of Europe in the world, and that was also very much present in the last book on the Iberian world empires, and even in the things that I am doing now. So that is a trajectory in which the different contexts in which I have been in contact with have been really very, very important. It's not a sort of personal decision. It has to be very much with the context in which I've been present. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. And so my next question is very tied to this to your answer. And so since a major contribution of your work to our knowledge of empires, to global history and empire, and was the incorporation of the southern Europe, the southern European perspective on the formation of empires, on both state formation and economic developments in empires. And so my question will be, how did the incorporation of Southern European perspective of state formation, economic development, how change the historiographic of empires? Because before you and other, most of the debate about empires and economic development and state formation mostly based on England and France. So, and lately, thanks to your work and also to Italian scholars working in Italy, and to a lesser level, also people working on scholar work on the Ottoman Empire. So, but general question, how this Southern Mediterranean perspective on empire change our knowledge, of empire?
Thank you, Tommaso. I mean, I think that at this point, the academic world is quite integrated, not as much as we would like. And then it is not so easy to differentiate between those perspectives that you were saying. But it's true that there is something different when we look at the world from the Iberian empires, and when we try to construct a pattern or a model of or a path of imperial development, and we try to compare with other empires. One of the problems is that, to put it in a very peculiar way, is that empires are too big. And since they are too big, it's difficult to cope with all the literature that we have about them. But it is even more difficult to cope with the literatures about other empires. So the comparisons and the perspective of other empires from one particular empire is really very difficult. But there was and still there is a feeling among scholars working on the Iberian empires that sometimes their findings are, I wouldn't say ignored, but marginalized when one speaks about empires in general. That is true and it is not true. So there are many good books in which the Iberian empires are very much present, but it's also true that sometimes we see that they are looking for some particular schemes and point of view. One of them was the idea that those empires were a failure because they didn't fit with the idea of empires of the 19th century, which were completely different empires. And that's why I thought, and also because part of the book was conceived, it was not written in the UI, but it was conceived, my book on the Iberian War empires was conceived here in the Institute. And that's why I thought that maybe to look at empires from the perspective of the Iberian empires could be a good decision. And that's why also the book, the English version, then it's been translated also and summarized, shorted out, has been translated into Spanish and also to Portuguese. But the English version is a version very much thought for Anglophone students and Anglophone colleagues. And the idea was using the same conceptual framework that has been used several times for the British or for the French or for the Dutch Empire, and to discuss, to look at the Iberian empires with these conceptual frameworks to establish a sort of dialogue that can give us a more nuanced and richer image of the phenomenon of empires in history. So it's not a sort of saying these were the same, but it was a way of saying these were different, but not in the sense that sometimes we have thought. And it was also a way to fight against something that is one of the duties of any historian, is to fight against exceptionalism. So the feeling that our cultural or national communities are different in everything. The idea was that by making comparison, things that we think are exceptions are not exceptions. Once we make the comparison, we can see that they are just different in some particular ways. They are not aberrations. They are not, put it in this way, they are not ill experiences. They are normal but different. And that was one of the intentions of this book and of the other things that I'm doing now. I must say that this is a difficult exercise because you never know which the reception of these type of things is going to be. And this type of history, the way it is read depends very much on the reader, and the reader has particular contexts. And the reader can look at the same problem from different experiences, and then he can or she can be in agreement or in disagreement, depending on that perspective. This is something that global historians know very well. The global history is always problematic because it's always providing with new discourses to people who are embedded in a particular point of view. But that was the idea.
Thank you very much for this answer. And I mean, just to continue following on this thread, and so since you mentioned this problem of the terminology using for comparison and in different in the academic traditions, so until my next question will be following this thread. So until recently, most economists and historians working in the framework of new institutional economics have stressed the importance of formal state institutions over informal institutions like social networks for long-term development. So in your recent research, you criticize this view, and you show the importance on an informal institution, and you reduce the importance of this striking dichotomy between informal and informal institutions, which are term coined by a particular brand of economists and economic historians following them. So my question would be: do you think that this dichotomy or opposition between formal and informal is finally over? It's finally in economic history, or do you think that the emphasis on formal institution as the most important criteria for long economic growth are still some appeal for historians?
That distinction comes, as you know, from the new institutional economics, and maybe it makes sense for nowadays societies in many senses. If we take it as a sort of analytical tool or heuristic tool. The idea when I wrote that book was that there was the possibility to use that perspective in a certain way to problematize the universal meaning of that distinction. So when we go to history, what we find is that that distinction is not always so clear, and that sometimes that distinction is not always explain everything. So history in this sense is doing its own role, which is to criticize theories and to criticize the universalism of theories. But to do that, I had to take that approach. Otherwise, it would have been impossible in a whole book. That would be possible maybe for an article, but not for a book. And this is, I think, one of the contributions that the scholars working on the early modern Iberian empires or the early globalization are doing in this moment, because these were empires in which those so-called informal institutions were crucial. In this moment, I think that I would prefer, rather than to speak about formal and informal institution, I would maybe prefer to speak about sort of informal enforcement mechanism. When we use this term, we are putting the accent on the way conflicts are resolved, transaction costs are minimized, and the way people face risk by using mechanisms of enforcement of their agreement, which are internal to their own social networks without going to a third party, which is the terminology of the new institutional economics. If we make that distinction, it is easier to apply this conceptualization to societies in which the difference between the public and the private spheres was not so clear as it is today. And the good, digamos, let's say the good aspect, the good outcome of all this is that we can look at those societies more as they were and raise questions that for the moment were not so much present, and then go to open the scope of our analysis and see that most empires in history have been ruled by informal institutions, so that they were very much present in the way empires were creating trust. The agents within the empires were creating trust, that they were very important in connecting different areas of the empires, both politically and socially and economically, and that at the same time these had an impact in the way empires were ruled. Because my point, the point of the book, is that these informal enforcement mechanisms were very important in creating trust, but also were very important in establishing the limits of the globalization of those empires. So these empires in the 17th century had to face globalization. That means tensions in many areas of the world in which they were present. And at that point, maybe more formal institution would have been a way to raise resources in a more efficient way. So they had to change. The 18th century is precisely the need to change, is presided by the need to change all this system from inside to face globalization. Now, if we look at the history of empires from this perspective, it's quite possible that we will change the view that we have of them. And that is not only something that has been raised by Iberian historians or by myself. That is something which is implicit also in many concepts which are present also in the historians working on the British Empire. For example, the notion of informal empires is very much close to what I am saying. It's not exactly the same, but it's very much close to what I am saying, and that is not that has been applied to the study of the British Empire. The notion of empires in the shadow is also very much close to what I am saying. It's not exactly the same again, but it's very much close to what I am saying. So we can also now go to all these other empires to see to what extent they were different. The image we get from the study is different from the image we had before. This is very important because for many years what we have done in the past is to try to apply, not always successfully, the scheme of the British, the French, or even other empires to the Iberian empires. Now I think it's a good moment to do the opposite, to create a real dialogue and to see those empires from this perspective. And we will see that there are many similarities. And that they were not exceptional. In many ways, the exception are empires like the British, for example. That would be maybe, but even that idea of British exceptionalism is being revised in this moment, and I think it can be even more revised, even more changed, if we look at them from what Iberianists have said about the Iberian empires.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your answer, and I would like to ask if you may tell us something about some subjects that are very present in the current historiographical debate and that have attracted your attention in the last years, also because of your of this change in your scope in your work. No, I'm referring to the notion of global history and the nuances and distinctions that you propose between transnational history, global history, and the history of globalization. And if in this regard you think that it is thinkable and desirable a global history of globalization.
Thank you very much. This is also a very timely question, because one of the problems when we speak about global history is that there are different definitions. I think that at this point we are getting a sort of consensus among the specialists on what we mean when we say global history. At a certain point, and I'm not the first to say this, global history has much to do with transnational history or entangled history, if you want, in the sense that what global history is trying to do is to understand connections. That's why some people link very much global history with connected history. Global history is trying to see connections and comparisons between different societies, different polities, to see also the effects, the mutual and reciprocal effects of those societies, but also to compare them. In my view, there is a distinction that it is important for us to take into account, that, and I think is becoming also a sort of agreement among historians, which is the idea that global history is a viewpoint, is a perspective, is a way to look at the past by emphasizing those connections and the comparisons between different societies. And the history of globalization is something different. The history of globalization is a subject, is a process. It's something that we can understand by looking at it from the perspective of global history. But many colleagues agree. If you read, for example, the last statement by the editors of the Journal of Global History, they say the same. But if you read also Lin Hunt, he says the same. Many scholars now agree that global history is not necessarily something which has to be related to globalization. It is like if I study the history of some villages in Europe, it can be very interesting, but I am not, or in Spain, it can be very interesting, but I am not studying the formation of Spain. So you can do also global history without studying the globalization process. The globalization is only a part that can be studied by using this perspective. So I think that this is it's important to make this comparison and to emphasize that. Then you were asking about global history of globalization. That is perfectly possible, and that is, I think, one of the main, not the only, is one of the main aims of global history. So to understand how people got together in the past, together doesn't mean that they entered into agreement necessarily. Together means also people fighting between them. Together means also clashes, wars, etc. The building of walls separating different societies is also part of the globalization. We are having now a very good example in the case of the war that unfortunately we are going through in this moment. That is a sort of globalization, which is splitting different societies in different sides. And I think that if we try to understand globalization from this perspective, we will have a very good instrument to understand the past. Some people think that global history and the history of globalization are not very important, and that we should even leave aside this terminology. I don't mind if someone wants to speak about something different and wants to use another terminology. If someone wants to tell me that he or she doesn't speak about global history but about connected history, I will be very happy with that. I think that at this point, historians discussing about terminology is something that we have to consider very seriously. Not always it is very useful to discuss too much about terminology. Maybe it is useful to discuss about concepts, but not about terminology. But in any event, global history and the history of globalization is not a sort of choice. I think that many people in the world nowadays are trying to understand what they are by considering what other people are. And many people consider themselves as belonging to a human community, which is linked by many different type of associations. So it's important to answer their questions and to make them feel what is the impact of this process of globalizations in their current lives. So it's not a choice, something that is necessary from my point of view. You can call it as you want. That is not the problem.
Thank you for your answer. And since we enter the debate on global history, as a former student of hardcore microhistorians, in Italian, I'm going to ask you a very contested issue, which is can global history and microhistory collaborate in explaining global economic development? So in recent years, the works of Francesco Crivellato, Aslanians, and many others have demonstrated how a microhistory on a large scale, that is by focus on partnership of merchants and merchants network operating on a global scale, have shown how microhistory can help to answer some important questions relevant to global economic history. So what's your position about a possible collaboration between global and microhistory for economic history and also state formation history?
Well, here one of the problems is that if global history is something whose definition is not entirely accepted by all its practitioners, the case of microhistory is even worse. I mean, I must say that I sometimes have the feeling that different, even the fathers of the concept, sometimes I have the feeling that they are defining their field in a different way. That's why I sometimes prefer, rather than to speak about microhistory to avoid and to circumvent that problem, to speak about microanalytical approaches to the past. And this can be even wider than microhistory. It takes us from a debate that can become, as I said, a sort of terminological debate, which is useful in many ways, but not necessarily. But if we go to think about micro analysis and microanalytical to the past, so to look in the small, to try to see more general events and more general trends. And I think that they are completely compatible. So I don't see the problem. I know that some microhistorians think in a different way, but at this point, microhistory is not the patrimony, it's the patrimony of no one. We all can speak about microhistory, even if, it's in my case, I don't consider myself a microhistorian. But I think it's perfectly possible. So we can establish, we can look at some particular aspects or societies even before. I remember now that I was very much and very well positively impressed by the article by Francesca Crivellato that you quoted. I had written something about local and global history in a Swedish journal, in which I was telling precisely that I don't see an opposition between local history and global history. We can see a global phenomena at a local level, and therefore also at a micro level, either geographic or not, or social spaces, and then to try to connect them with more general events. And I think that is completely possible. There is no, I don't see a big problem. The point in my view is that, and this is something which is also proper of microhistory, is that the type of problem we want to resolve when we do this is a general problem. So it's something which has to do with general problems, and which are not a particular risk of a particular society, unless we want to see that this particular risk, this particular feature of that society is universal. And another thing that I find very interesting is that some of the microhistorians, I remember, for example, that is the case of Carlo Ginzburg, has spoken about the possibility to make comparisons by doing microanalytical approaches to history. If you can make connections, you can understand a wider universe by looking at a small case study. And you can also make good comparisons with other cases in other societies or in other contexts in the world. I don't see why to reject microhistory as a way of global history. The other problem is to what extent microhistory is the best way to address the history of globalization. But that is another problem. That is different. because here we are studying a process, and the macro history is rather breaking the continuity of a process. That was one of the reasons why it was born. And there we need to think a bit more. But I think that even in that sense, we will find very good ways to use it as an instrument. In my view, the historian should not reject instruments that can be useful. And as a global historian, any global historian should be very much open to see to what extent the macroanalytical approach is a good way to resolve their question. To reject it from the very beginning would be a mistake.
Thanks for your answer. Now, I would like to ask you about the globalization of historiography. Because one of the declared aims of global history was to take into account hidden spaces or forgotten spaces, forgotten actors, forgotten voices. But in many cases, the reality of the practice of global history ignores the scholarship produced in language other than English. And at the same time, most of these intellectual traditions, academic productions in French, Spanish, Italian, other languages than English, do not participate in the debates proposed by global history. What do you think about it, about these contradictions and misunderstandings?
Thank you. This is also a very timely question, because what some global historians are asking for now is not only to try to do global history as a sort of aim, but also to see how the different historiographies can be globalized. So how to put in contact different historiographies. And this comes also from the idea that in many occasions, what global historians are doing is a sort of global history from a particular perspective, from a particular academic or scientific background. So the type of history that I can write from Southern Europe, about, for example, the Iberian empires and the role of empires in globalization, because there are two different things. Imperial history and global history are not exactly the same, but they are connected. But the type of history I can do from my academic background maybe is quite different from the type of history that a colleague from Buenos Aires can do, or from the Philippines, about the Spanish empires. And this is something which is relatively well accepted at this point by global historians. The only antidote that we have against that, if that is a problem, it's not necessarily a problem, because if we have two different perspectives about the same phenomenon, what we have is a base for debate, and not necessarily a problem. Debate is never a problem. But this is something that many global historians tend to accept in this moment. And it has to do also with the intellectual framework of the different people and the different academic systems. We have to consider that a Chinese has been educated in an intellectual framework which is very much different from mine. So what he said about, or she said about the same phenomenon is very interesting for the two cases. So it is very important to globalize global history. And it is very important, therefore, to create bridges of communication with other global historians or not global historians. So people who are aware about the same phenomenon, who are trying to understand the the same problems in different areas from different perspectives. And here we have the typical problem of historians. History, as you know, is a very nationalistic discipline from the 19th century. It was born very much linked to the nation, to the born of the nation state in Europe, and it is nationally framework. And so the dialogue is difficult, and it's also difficult because of a problem of languages and academic circuits. So not everything which is very good and has been written in an area of the world is written in another area of the world. And not everything which is really interesting or contributing on a particular subject is known in another area of the world. The good point here is that globalization is also creating connections between all of us. And the circulation of information and communication, thanks to the digital systems, which has many problems, but which can be also accelerated, can accelerate. The digitalization can accelerate the communication among us. And in many cases, it is even accelerating the communication and the use of different languages. So at this point, we have something that can allow us to try to go to a global history of global history, historiography. Here the problem is rather a problem of academic walls. It's a problem of languages. In the case, for example, of the Iberian empires, which is the case I have been more interesting in the last 10 or 20 years. One of the problems is a problem of historiography, and is a problem also of the fact that we tend to see our cases as exception and as special case studies, which is true. They are not exception, but this positioning, we tend also to create our own vocabulary that is not always shared by people working on other empires. And so here communication is the best thing to do. I think that we should maybe run away from too specific terminology that maybe is not so specific from the cases we are studying. And we have to be more in contact with other historiographies, trying to speak similar languages. We have many examples of this in the recent history. I'm now trying to finish an article on these things. And one of the things that I was very much impressed by reading the different literature is that, for example, this is only one example, when you read subaltern studies, you see that there is a whole construction about the history of India and about how subalterns were keeping the hegemony even in a situation of political dominion. This is the terminology of Guha and many other colleagues, which has been really very fertile and has been excellent that they called our attention about these type of things. But what is interesting from the perspective of a person who is trying to deal with the Iberian world is that this, not the terminology, but the ideas were at a certain point present among historians and anthropologists working on Latin America. In part, this idea of dominion and hegemony, cultural hegemony, etc., is present also in all this trend of Iberianismo, indigenismo. Indigenism was precisely an attempt to see the history of these territories in America, but also in Asia, from the perspective of the subaltern, and to try to understand how those people were dealing with an external power, which was the Portuguese, but also the Spanish Empire. And of course, people working on indigenismo, many of them, or most of them, don't quote or don't enter an explicit dialogue with the subaltern colleagues, with the colleagues working on the subaltern studies in India, and vice versa. So you see that there are connections that can be bridges. There are gaps that can be bridges as long as they try to put concepts in common and to discuss among them. All the recent literature, in generally speaking, the recent literature on the Iberian empires, which has stressed so much the agency of the subalterns, in many occasions they are not using the intellectual tools created by the subaltern studies. So that is an example on how sometimes we are dealing with the same subjects with different vocabularies in different ways. To put ourselves together to the other and to try to connect it, these historiographies would be, I think, very important. Also because, as I said before, our duty is to talk to people who want to know about other people, who wants to have sort of, who have a sense of human community. And this is what our world is asking for now.
Thank you very much for the answer. And yeah, since we are discussing about new opportunities now in global history, and so to continue following this discussion, also I would like to ask about. So we discussed about new perspective, new possibility. But what about new also risk? Are there new challenges facing now by historians writing global history? What are the main challenges they face today in writing global history?
Challenges there are many. One of them is that of the difficult communication among us. Some people say that global history is a sort of Anglophone history about the others. That is a danger. So is that sometimes we just transpose a sort of dominant historiography towards other words, and that is one of the dangers. But my impression is that the reaction among historians against that has been so strong that we will be able to overcome that problem in the future. I'm quite optimistic regarding this problem, particularly if the journals and the publishers, and this is the important thing, are sensitive to other discourses and to other approaches, and are open to those approaches. Here, one of the problems is the closeness of the academic circles, and sometimes it is more a problem of academic structures than a problem of scientific approaches. The key is to be very, very, very open to discuss, of course, what we are receiving. My experience, for example, is that sometimes I see some reactions from a colleague working on a particular area. So area studies can create a sort of facile critique to what global historians are saying based on their local knowledge and expertise, without realizing that the key here is not what we say about a particular area, but what we say about the connections with other areas of the world, and what we say about the effect of those connections in some particular regions and areas. So sometimes area studies are seen as a problem, and there are colleagues who in many occasions, even unconsciously, critique global historians because they lack this, they lack the other concept, etc. But global history is not the history of everything under the sun. Global history is something different. So if we try to overcome this type of problems, which are very human and which are very easy to understand, I hope that we will have a more global history and a more global history of globalization. There is another problem that I have the impression, which is can become very important in the future, and which is also a reflection of the effects of globalization in the in nowadays nation states, is that the problem of the potential nationalization of global history. So global history was born to relativize the national narratives to history, or what some sociologists call the national methodology. So it was born to try to show people that nations are important, but they are the product of interconnections, very open interconnections, very open links among the different societies. But we can see now that there are some trends precisely on the opposite. That is a way to use this context of links and connection to reinforce nationalist discourses. That is happening, for example, in China. So you can see it even in the public sphere. For example, if you go to the publicity on the Silk Road that the Chinese government is doing in the last years, you will see that Marco Polo is not in the Silk Road. Marco Polo was inexistent for this historiographic construction. The Silk Road was produced by the Chinese. And the Silk Road, and therefore also the globalization, is a product of the Chinese action. And as far as globalization, sometimes wrongly in my view, is connected to modernization, that can be presented as a merit. That can be presented as something which is good. That was the contribution of a particular country to the world. But we can see the same also in other countries. In my own country, some years ago, when this celebration of the Magallanes and Elcano round trip to the world started, there was a debate between, even with implications in the political sphere, even in the government of the two countries, trying to resolve the problem and to what extent that was the merit of the Portuguese or the Spanish. That is the nationalization of global history. If we go to the fact, what we see that there were people like Magallanes or Elcano, who were, one of them was Portuguese, was naturalized in Castile. The other was a Basque, connected to the crown of Castile, and they were collaborating in intermingling knowledge and concepts, and they do that, but not because they were Spanish or Portuguese. And I think this is important to tell to people that this is the point. But this has continued in this case, and now we have sometimes this type of books that sometimes some of them are very good, others are not so good because imitations sometimes are quite wrong. Speaking about, I don't know, France and globalization, Mexico and globalization, etc., in which if you define what this nation state was and is already in the 15th century, then what you find is a nationalization of global history. Of globalization. So you see that we are creating a sort of exclusive, not always exclusive, but in many cases, in any case, national pride because of the participation of nationalization. And that is true, but it's not true in many senses. So as long as this type of discourses becomes exclusive and not inclusive, we can go precisely against the meta-narrative for which global history was born. And it's important to tell the citizens that sometimes we have to be careful with that. That's why I like to blend two perspectives which for some colleagues are opposed: global history and history of empires. You know that there are colleagues who think that these are two things that cannot be blended, that they are completely opposed. But the advantage of using the history of empires to study globalization and to do global history is that empires tell us very much about dialogue, negotiation, technological development, etc., etc. Things that from our perspective seems to be very positive. But empires tell us very much about violence, coercion, suffering of people, slavery, etc. Empires tell us also the negative side of globalization. And we have to be aware that globalization is not only that is good per se, it's something that is a product of many different actions in many different contexts, sometimes based on dominion and violence.
Thanks. Thanks for your answer. We are approaching to the end of the interview, and at this point, we would like to ask you about your current research and future projects.
Well, this is the question that is the most difficult to answer, because at the end sometimes you have the feeling that you will not be able to carry out till the end your projects. But I keep working on the Iberian empires. I think that this is something which is important in my view, and it has a historical content, but also on globalization. I'm very much worried about some of the subjects that you pointed out, historiographies, and the way some historiographies can have can be more visible, you have more presence in a discourse that necessarily has to be open, which is the discourse of globalization. But also interested, but I must say I'm very slow in this, in the history of transnational nobilities, both in Europe but also in connection with the empires. This is something that I'm trying to understand, to be honest, in a proper way. And then there is something that I don't like to talk about, but I will do it now, which is I'm very much interested in the history of a civilian painter that you maybe know is Bartolomé Murillo, and I'm writing a book on his paintings and the way Murillo's painting can reflect a different view that the view we have of 17th century Spain, but also can reflect globalization processes, because at the end Murillo is a very interesting character for this side, because one very single reason: Murillo never traveled to any other place than Madrid. He only stayed in Madrid for 6 months. That is very interesting in my view. So how to look at these problems from the eyes of a person who was not a global character as we understand it normally today. So that is also intriguing for me.
Okay, so with this final and unexpected news about this other Bartolomé that also lived in Seville but traveled less than you, we finish our interview, and thank you for your willingness to share with you your ideas, experience, and projects.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you, and I hope that the interview was if not interesting, at least a bit useful for people who wants to discuss my own opinions, my opinions. Thank you.